As the cost of housing increases in global cities, what strategies can cities employ to maintain affordable housing? To discuss, your next panel features moderator Andrew Edgecliffe-Johnson, U.S. business editor, Financial Times. From the Housing and Development Authority of Singapore, Koon Cheong. Obinna Okwodu of Fibre, the World Economic Forum's Alice Charles, and Stephen Weir of Habitat for Humanity International.
All right, thank you very much, everybody, for being here, and thank you to my panel. I can't think of a single theme that runs more consistently through every other subject we've been discussing at this event and in previous years' events than the challenge of housing the populations of these ever-growing, ever more successful global cities. It goes from accommodating immigrants and refugees, the subject we were discussing on a panel of mine yesterday, to how to attract the next Amazon. The fear factor I detected when I was traveling around, places from Denver to Nashville, all vying for that kind of contract, for X thousand tech workers. The big downside that every person in every bar and every taxi you talk to was, what's it going to do for the cost of housing? Where are we going to put them all? And what's it do for house prices? So this is a huge concern in every global city. But we're also seeing some really interesting solutions start to present themselves. Just by way of brief introduction, to give you a sense of the scale of the challenge. If you read this report, this World Economic Forum report, which Alice has authored, you'll see the UN estimates that only 13% of major cities have affordable housing. That's a stunning statistic. McKinsey has estimated that 330 million households are living in substandard housing, or they're in some way financially stretched by the cost of their housing. And they see that going to 440 million households by 2025, just 6 years from now. That's the number of households. The number of people affected is 1.6 billion people. The nature of the challenge is equally striking. This is a political challenge. It's about physical resources. It's about financial resources. It's about money. It's about the coordination of all of those things. And we'll talk about this on the panel, I hope. And it's clearly a growing challenge as house prices increase in global cities. More and more people are being priced out. There's an estimated cost of upgrading all the world's substandard housing in major cities and building enough new housing, $9 to $11 trillion, of which $1 to $3 trillion will have to come from public financing. So is unaffordable housing the inevitable cost of the success of our global cities? We want to discuss this with a terrific panel who are representing all points of the world, all sorts of different perspectives. Their bios are up on screen. I won't go into long introductions. But I want to start, because of this report that she's written, with Alice. Can you just define for us how you see the challenge of affordable housing? Because it is so broad, you could go in any direction. How have you tried to set a definition around it?
So, first of all, in this report, we found that more than 90% of cities around the world don't have affordable housing. They have a challenge in providing affordable housing. And that's particularly critical in the global south. The situation in Africa is around 50% of housing is substandard. In India and China, it's around 25%. And by the time we get to 2050, around 2.5 billion people in the world will be living in substandard housing. So that situation is obviously completely unsustainable. So what we have looked at in this particular report is the demand side and supply side challenges across the housing value chain that are contributing to the affordability problem. We've really sought to, first of all, unpack the affordable housing challenge. So when people talk about affordability, they generally think of it in terms of the cost of buying a home. But it actually goes beyond that. It's the life cycle cost of that home. So, if you can afford to buy a home, but you cannot afford to operate and maintain that home, and you cannot avail of services, for example, schools, public transit, and so on, within a sort of a 20-minute neighborhood, if you like, then that house is obviously not affordable. And by not providing a life cycle approach, you end up with a situation where people, for example, enter into energy poverty. So they cannot afford to heat and cool their property. So, that house obviously was not affordable in the first place. So in terms of looking at the factors that contribute to the affordable housing problem, we spent quite a bit of time in this report looking at the land challenges. So that's the land acquisition and title challenges. So, for example, we took a look at mechanisms to pool land. We took a look at mechanisms to formally acquire land, to negotiate acquiring land, because actually a lot needs to happen in land. What we find, even as I did interviews after we released this report, which was just yesterday, the media was interested in the incremental changes in the area of technology and innovation, but not interested in land. But actually, if you don't focus on land, you will not address the problem. So, there are mechanisms being adopted to try and look at how you can pool land. For example, in Hamburg and Copenhagen, they have urban wealth funds. And that is where government has taken responsibility, all arms of government, and starting to pool their land and starting to think about how they can better develop their land, not just for housing, but associated community infrastructure and services. Infrastructure can be a big barrier to entry in the first place because, particularly if costly infrastructure needs to be provided, then particularly the private sector will not enter the market. The other thing that we did look at in this report was the whole area of land use and regulation. So zoning policies actively need to be looked at because, if you look at certain cities, for example, land may be zoned for industrial development. However, there's a lot of vacant stock on that particular site, or that land is no longer useful for industrial development. So you need to think about how you can redevelop that land. And I think, Ken Livingstone, for example, in London many years ago, did a really good job of rethinking the East End of London, yep. And which was industrial land, relocating many of those industrial users to elsewhere in the city, and redeveloping that land for the Olympics, which we all know about, but also for vital housing stock. We also took a look at vacancy in the land use piece. There is so much vacant stock in cities around the world, and cities like Vancouver and Paris and Melbourne are doing interesting things, looking at how you can sort of assess the amount of land that is vacant without having people going door to door. And in Melbourne, they were able to use smart water grid technology to assess, we all use a certain amount of water every day, and if you're not using that water, then clearly that property is vacant and you can tax accordingly. In Vancouver and Paris, they were leveraging electricity data in that regard. So it's very important to understand what's vacant as well from a city point of view. Then I guess the other pieces that we've looked at in this report is around the financing piece. So how can you attract the funding and investment, as well as the design and construction piece. So a lot of the cost sits in land, but actually to a lesser extent, a lot of cost lies in construction. So we looked at how you can reduce the cost of construction by increasing the supply of labour on the one hand. For example, the Mayor of London has an academy which is focused on skilling workers so that you get the right skilled workers to be able to be involved in the construction sector. But we also looked at the innovations that are happening. And that's everything from, in India, they're looking at using glass fibre reinforced materials as an alternative to standard concrete. So that reduces the amount of concrete that you use, reduces the amount of steel, and it's good for the environment.
So you have this huge array of recommendations here, which go from the policy arena, some quite sort of nitty-gritty zoning, the stuff that cities do every day, all the way through to new technologies. Just for another sort of framing question, if I can, to Steve. Going back to what I was saying about how this really is a question on the mind of everybody thinking about anybody from refugees coming into your city to Amazon employees. When you look at this problem from the perspective of an organization like Habitat, who do you think we should be focusing on helping as we try to provide more affordable housing?
So we think about it in two ways. It's a really tough question. Habitat's known for working in the community, I mean, I'm curious, how many people here either have been on a Habitat work site or know somebody that has? See, that's a lot of hands for this group. So we're known to be in the community, doing stuff, making it happen. We feel good about it. But that actually doesn't scale. Our idea about having people on the job site is so that they understand the community and how we're more alike than we're different. In terms of attacking at scale, we look at systems change. So for example, if you look internationally, we looked at all the microfinance organizations around the world, and we learned that they had about 2% of their portfolio was in housing. And we did the math, and we said if we could move from 2% to 10%, not 100%, 2% to 10%, we could unlock $4 billion a year into the marketplace for housing, for self-improved housing. It would be tough for us to ourselves raise $4 billion, but we are starting to see demonstration impacts across the world with microfinance organizations allocating more of their portfolio to housing.
Has that needle started to move?
It is starting to move. So in 35 different countries, we have now loaned $109 million, and the rates of return for payment are higher than their actual production loans. And we're seeing other MFIs in their region also copying their programs, and they're reallocating within the MFI itself more funding over. So that's an example of kind of a single line trying to change the supply of finance. And maybe just really quickly.
But if you were a mayor in this audience, having to think about prioritizing your efforts and your resources on the provision of affordable housing, would you be thinking about the people at the very bottom of the kind of economic scale? Would you be thinking about the school teachers and firefighters? Would you be thinking about the next Amazon programmer?
So context matters.
Yeah.
So I think it depends on where you are a mayor and what your city looks like. If you're a mayor in Dallas, Texas, you have a requirement that firemen and policemen live in the city, but they don't. They actually, 10 to 12, rent one room in a flop house that normally rents by the hour, so they have a postal address, and they commute an hour and a half, 3 hours a day, in and out.
Yep.
So they created a down payment assistance program. We worked with them to do that. If you're the mayor in a developing country, and you know that 80 to 90% of the housing improvements are self-managed in informal sectors, then you need to talk to microfinance organizations and skilling and some of the things that Alice was talking about. Right. If you're a mayor in Budapest, then you find out that 50% of the units are vacant, and they're vacant because the Hungarians that own them have moved abroad, and they don't want to rent it to a Hungarian and not be able to evict them when they stop paying. So housing is complex. Some regulation, some access to finance, and some of it's recognizing the rights of informality and trying to understand how to deal with it.
Huge variety. So let's talk for a moment about Singapore, because it's hard to remember now when we think of the image we have of Singapore in our minds. 50 years ago, Singapore had slums. And one of the most acute challenges in the affordable housing debate is how do you accommodate the roughly 1 billion people in the world who live in slums now. But has Singapore solved the problem?
All right, that's a big question too. Can I just check how many in the audience have actually been to Singapore? Oh, thank you, I don't have to explain. But okay. I come from the public housing authority called the Housing and Development Board, and the joke is that in Singapore, the public housing is like the air you breathe, because everywhere you go, you see it. And why is that so? Well, we run about 1.1 million flats in 26 towns, and we actually house about 82% of the population. It's rather unusual. So a lot of people, and so it caters from very low income to middle income. And the model is unusual because it's a home ownership model, not a rental model. So about 94% of the people who live in my housing actually own their own flats. The 6% is actually only for rental for the very, very low income. So the question was, who do you cater for? We try to cater for everybody. So that's one answer to that question in our case. Then the issue is people ask, so how do you do it? What's the secret sauce? I have 5 minutes or 4 minutes to talk about the secret sauce. So I'll try and give 4 quick dashes of the secret sauce. I think the first thing is you must be committed to doing it. And we were indeed a place of slums and squatters only 50 years ago. Those who know Singapore, you won't believe me, but it is true. We were all full of slums. So the government, the newly formed government, we became independent then, about the same time as Sri Lanka. And the priority was to provide a home for people, for nation building, because we were a motley crew of migrants from everywhere, including my father. And we felt it was important for people to own something in the country. So they formed the Housing and Development Board. It's to provide an institution with capacity to deliver, both policy and in building. And so Housing Development Board was formed. And actually within 10 years, the Housing and Development Board, HDB, built more flats than all that were built under the British rule when we were a colony. And pretty much in a way provided a lot of the basic housing. But going forward, so the first thing is to make it affordable. How do you make it affordable? We make it affordable by providing a range of housing for all incomes and budgets, 2, 3, 4, 5 rooms and rental, right? So first thing. Secondly is the word that many city governments don't like. It's called subsidies. I think for to make housing affordable, you do need to subsidize, particularly in global cities because of the divergence of very expensive housing and the lack of actually affordable housing. So you have to provide subsidies, and they're tiered according to income. So the lower income you are, the more subsidies you get. Now the third point is, but people should be able to find a way to pay for the housing, because how can city governments afford to subsidize all the time, right? So the third secret ingredient is, how do we get people to pay for the housing? In Singapore, we have the Central Provident Fund, which is a compulsory savings scheme, pretty much like your pension fund. Now, when I work, every month, 20% of my pay goes into the CPF, the Central Provident Fund. My employer pays 17%. So immediately, everybody has a 37% savings. And of the 37%, 23% can be used for housing, any type, private housing or public housing. 8% is locked up for your retirement, and 6% goes into MediSave, which is a health insurance. So every Singaporean has health insurance as well. So from the 23%, they can use that to pay mortgage. Now, as a HDB, I will price my flat to make sure that you can pay 25% or less of your income. So if you take the money from the CPF, which is 23%, you pretty much can pay for your mortgage with no cash outlay every month. So you actually get housing without paying anything because it comes from the pension fund. So I price it so that it's properly priced for you to be able to afford it. I price based on affordability, right? And therefore, I take off all the fluctuations in the property market, construction costs, etc. I absorb it. Now, then you say, but how can you afford it? Nobody can afford this model, right? So the question is, how much do we actually pay to house 82% of the population? How much of the city budget? I raise funds, bonds, to pay for the capital cost, and I have a 32 billion medium-term note. I'm the second largest bond issuer after the central bank in Singapore, right? That pays for. But then, secondly, there is a budget deficit, obviously, because I am giving grants and subsidies. The budget subsidy is actually only about 1 to 2 billion Singapore dollars every year, and that forms less than 3% of the city budget every year. So for 3%, 2.5 to 3% of the city budget, you can house 82% of the population. I think that's a pretty good price to pay.
I think that several people would take that,
right.
take that offer if they were given it.
Yeah, so I think in a nutshell, just one last point I'd like to make is, actually public housing in Singapore is not about housing. That's a very strange sentence. Because public housing is really to give people a social safety net. We look at the life cycle of the citizen. He buys a flat when he's young, when he's just married. So I have to tell this joke. I know it's taking up 30 seconds of the time. In Singapore, when the man proposes to the woman, he doesn't propose with a diamond ring. He says, would you like to apply for a public housing flat with me? That's worth more than a diamond ring.
Not only has Koon Hean given us her 4-minute secret sauce recipe, she's also given us great chat-up lines to try next time we're in Singapore. Unbelievable. This is the value you get at the forum that you don't get. Obinna, you, until a couple of years ago, were a real estate analyst in New York City working for Morgan Stanley.
That's correct.
And you decided to move to Lagos to launch a company called Fibre. What problem were you trying to solve with it?
Okay, so Nigeria has a really peculiar rental market, right? And it manifests in two ways. One being financial, and the other being discriminatory. So on a financial level, if you're looking to rent an apartment in Lagos today, you would have to come up with up to 2 years of cash upfront to be able to get the keys for your apartment. And as you can imagine, that creates such a high barrier to entry, especially for young professionals who are, just out of college and have their first job and are just looking for a place to live. And the second is, depending on your ethnicity and your gender, you could be turned away from renting apartments in specific parts of the city. And so both of these things combine to create a really high barrier that a lot of people, especially young professionals, have to scale just to be able to find a place to live. And so we started Fibre, and you can think about it as an apartments.com equivalent in the US, but taking it a step further to actually go out and rent apartments from property owners and investors and make them available for young professionals in an equal opportunity way to rent these places and pay monthly or quarterly or however is convenient for them. So really doing the work to decrease that barrier that they have to scale just to be able to find a place to live. And why is this important? So today, between the ages of 18 and 35, there's about 31 million people in Nigeria. In 10 years, that number is going to double. In 20 years, that number is going to triple. And to have to have 90 million people, right, young people in a productive class, worried about how they're going to live, where they're going to live, to have that be such a major worry, we think is a real productive drain on the society, and so we're kind of trying to solve the problem earlier on.
So these are not the most vulnerable people in the city, but they're core to the vitality of a city like Lagos.
Yes, so they're not the most vulnerable, but they are still, they are having a hard time, finding accommodation. These are business owners. These are, folks who are, middle income, upper middle income folks that just have a hard time affording a place to live. So you can imagine how much harder it is for people lower down the ladder.
So the two of you are representing, in crude terms, an ownership model and a rental, a city with a rental model. Alice, did you and your team form a view about which was the better solution to the affordability crisis?
No, because I think depending on your situation, you will require a different model. And definitely what we were promoting in this report is that you provide for a mix of tenures and a mix of models in terms of ownership on the one hand, shared ownership, for example, on the other, complete rental. So it really depends on your situation. And just to add to that, I think it's not just mixed tenure housing that's required. It's, to use jargon, it's pepper potting, so that the mix of types of houses are equally distributed. So, one of the things is that you often see in cities that social housing is provided in isolation in a particular area, and it's not integrated into the community. And over time, you can create a ghetto by doing just that. Whereas if you integrate different types of housing and create a real mixed community, you're not going to have those problems further down the line.
Can I just add to that? I think that tenure is also an opportunity to think about long-term affordability in the city. If you look at most of the things that we have, they're short-term, even if it's 15 years. You look at LIHTC as low-income tax credits that we have here in the US. They're good for 15 years. 20% of the people have to be low income. But what we're finding is those expire, there aren't low-income tax credits to apply for to continue, or the price of the neighborhood is increased enough that the real estate developer that owns the property doesn't want to actually turn it back into affordable housing, and so they raise it to market rates. And so in 15 years, we lose 80% of the transit hub affordable housing.
Yep.
And so there are ways, community trust funds, deed restrictions, there are a range of different ways to hold land that actually can help us make sure there's proper affordable housing long term.
Can I just make a comment on your question? And you asked, should it be a rental or home ownership model? And I absolutely agree that it depends on the context. I just want to introduce this idea that housing need not just be housing. It can be used as a social safety net for the entire life cycle of a person. So the reason we introduce home ownership, for example, is because, well, when you're young, all right, you get married and then we give you a flat, but then as you grow older and when you retire, we want you to be able to monetize the housing, and you can only do it because you own it. So you might have bought a bigger flat, but when you are retired, your children would have bought another flat from me. We allow you to sell and you keep all the proceeds. Now, part of the proceeds actually go back into the Central Provident Fund, which you actually borrowed from to buy the housing. Now, in the CPF, this money is converted to an annuity scheme, which means now you live in a fully paid smaller flat, but you have an annuity scheme which pays you a monthly income for life. So the housing also is used for retirement adequacy.
Yeah.
So there's an interesting discussion there about rental, which is you keep paying the rent, but you will not get anything back, versus a home ownership model, which builds equity for you at the point of retirement. You get some money back, and it's to help you in your retirement. So that, I think, is an interesting conversation when you look at the two models.
It's a very centralized model. I mean, I suppose the question is, sitting in a place like Chicago, can you ever see that level of sort of central control taking off in a U.S. city?
I think it's tough. So if we look at different cities over time, so you think about we sometimes talk about expensive cities, expansive cities, and legacy cities. Legacy cities is really a nice name for the Rust Belt, where people are moving out of those cities. The house price is plummeting. The mayor of Flint, Michigan famously said, our houses would be worth more if the people who left took their house with them.
Right.
And so the cost of housing, when there's a lot of empty houses as the cities change their character, so it's a risk. It could be better. It may or may not be better.
That could be your next startup, just moving houses from Flint, Michigan. I want to allow time for questions from the audience. So please, we do have a question over here, and we've got a couple of microphones, and then I'll come to you. Would you just tell us just a little behind you there, would you tell us who you are, your affiliation, and whether you want
Hi, Scott Bernstein, Center for Neighborhood Technology here in Chicago. One thing that's happened, interestingly, in the U.S. over the last few years is the growth of house sharing as a way of providing no-build housing, in effect. We're up to, according to the latest study, over 40 million adults who are living in somebody else's home. What they needed wasn't a building permit, they just needed permission to be able to do this. We're not short on real estate in the United States, so I wonder if any of you could comment on that as a necessary part of a portfolio. And yes, it does include low and moderate income people participating, saving up to $5,000 a year according to the HHS. So it would seem to be a cost-effective way to get there, to lower the barriers in addition to some of the other things that have been mentioned. Thank you.
Do you have experience in that?
So I think going back to what we were previously discussing, you need a mix of models.
Right.
And co-living isn't necessarily going to be the one solution. A lot of people are talking about it right now as if it's the solution to the problem, but actually you need systemic change to solve the overall problem. I think one of the things is that organizations like We Live, they could expand exponentially to cities around the world, but regulation is such that it doesn't really allow for that. And what you are seeing, though, is that in some cities, you are seeing these shared ownership, shared living models popping up. And the quality of them varies dramatically. So from a
and
policy...
is it just for 25-year-old Morgan Stanley analysts?
It's something that young professionals or students obviously would find more appealing than if you have kids, for example. It's not really the optimal way of living.
Nobody would want to share with my kids. I love them.
Or mine.
There are some interesting models though out there. So the shared living is one. There's a life cycle house where you have like a granny flat, but as a young married couple, you actually live in the small flat and you rent out the larger flat to a family. And then you get ready to have a family, you swap places, you still rent this out.
Yeah.
And then as they age and move out of the home, you move back into the smaller flats.
There's real traction, particularly as our society is increasingly aging, there's real potential and traction there, because you often find that there's a lot of older residents living in a part of a city which has the best infrastructure, the best schools, the best services, yet there's only one person living in a large house. So we need to find ways of freeing up that accommodation, and granny flats is a great way of doing that.
So I will say that in Lagos, where the supply and the demand is such a huge mismatch, especially in the actual quality of the supply that's available, shared housing is a savior. So we have about 40% of our stuff, of our supply is shared, stays at 100% occupancy, right? And it's all filled with 25-year-old analysts, like you said.
There's a lot of them around.
And so it's such a nice stopgap solution in the meantime, in a market where the supply hasn't really caught up to the demographics of the demand. So yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah, I think I agree with Alice. You really need a range of types of housing for different ages. Brings to mind the conversation by Richard Florida about the creative class, right? But then Edward Gleaser will tell you something different, because the creative class is all your 25-year-olds, your 30-year-olds. But if you have to have families, you need a home. Yeah. You need something beyond just a co-living type of environment. So the question really is to give a range of homes for different life cycles of people. So how do we do that in a portfolio within the city?
Can I go to a question in the second row here, if you can just hand the mic down? Thanks.
Hi, my name is Miguel Blancard Jr., born and raised here in Chicago in the southwest side, the Little Village neighborhood. And my question is regarding developers who are coming into certain neighborhoods, for example, and having predatory aspects in purchasing homes and then trying to resell them and hiring the value of the rent of all of the neighbors around. That's in particular this neighborhood here in Chicago. It's an immigrant community, mainly Latino, Mexican. So a lot of these individuals who have these homes migrated 80s, 90s, and now developers are coming in and kind of changing the dynamics of the communities.
It's really a gentrification question, I think. So I think gentrification is a huge issue in most developed countries. It's a huge issue here in the US. There are some safeguards, but the city this is something a mayor can do. There are safeguards around gentrification. Some of the things are that you can set up a community benefit trust or fund so that the families that stay behind, as a neighborhood gentrifies and the property taxes go up, you could, as a city, say that there'll be no property tax paid by existing residents above what they have today until they sell, and then it's all collected at sale, so they eventually get the funding. In some cases, they have a fund, and the fund pays for the difference as it rises. What gets left out is the affordable rental. So in those same neighborhoods, there are people who are renting some of those houses, and it's really hard because they do get pushed out, and sometimes pushed out in this country to the periphery where there's really no transportation or access to jobs. So gentrification is a serious issue.
And just to build on that, since the financial crisis, we have seen quite a few so-called vulture funds acquiring a lot of residential stock. And what has been happening is that in many cases you're seeing people who are occupying those residential developments being evicted because they want to increase the rents substantially. So there's an issue with regard to government, city government, national government, if they're responsible for housing, protecting the rights of homeowners so they're not vulnerable to this type of situation.
So how do you get the investment?
Not homeowners, occupiers, I should say.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
So what sort of expectations do you set around the money that you want to attract as a city to make sure it's not predatory? Can I just go back to the point about subsidy? Do you agree that a subsidy is essential, as an important starting point?
Well, in our case, I think because there's a real bifurcation of the very expensive housing that you will get in any global city, Chicago, New York, where your house price income ratios are like 15 or 20. We have been able to keep it to about 4 because of the public housing. So to a certain extent, yes, I think that subsidy is needed, but the issue really is how do you build an ecosystem around an economic model that allow people to pay. I think that's the key. It's not just about giving subsidies. I mean, all governments give subsidies for all sorts of things, right? Health, education, housing. But you cannot give a lot of subsidy because we can't afford it. So the key part of the formula is how do you get people to pay?
Right.
And for us, we use the CPF. I was at dinner last night and we had an interesting conversation whether this model is replicable. So I asked, what is the American model? You have the 401 or something like that.
401k.
Am I right? Something like a pension type of savings, but it's not compulsory. So the question is it replicable? Then my answer is, do you have the political will to do it? Because it's a compulsory savings scheme. So if
Is compulsion going to catch on?
Yeah. So
I would say that, to go back to the subsidy question, we love subsidies in the U.S. for housing. Our mortgage tax deduction is the largest housing subsidy of any country in the world. So $40 billion a year, 80% of that goes to the top 8% of wealth in the country, all over $100,000 a year. We spend less than a quarter of that on our housing subsidy for low-income families. So I would say that I think subsidies are not bad, but they do distort the market. So if you look at the U.S. compared to other places, we have a lot of single-family lots. We have more single-family, R1 single-family zoning than any other country in the world. And our subsidy incentivizes that. So if I have a bigger house, I have more land, and the government's willing to forgive some of my taxes on that, I can grow my wealth through that in ways that is a distorted policy. So I do think that policies can be good, but I think in the U.S. it's maybe time to re-examine our policies.
So I started with the example of Amazon, and we're running out of time now, but I wanted to ask a very FT question about whether business is the answer here. In Amazon's hometown, we've seen Microsoft try and address the chronic homelessness and affordable housing crisis in Seattle by saying it's going to provide $500 million in loans, affordable loans. Can we engage employers more? They need to be able to house their own workforces. Is this the model? Is this the solution?
I think that first of all, employers need to realize that the quality of housing stock that's provided in the city in which they're located in is a key consideration for employees before they would actually move to that location. So last year, for example, Mercer did a study of cities in the global south, and they, on the one hand, asked employers, why did employees move to your city? And of course, employers said, oh, because of my organization and my job. And then the other hand, they asked the employees, so why did you move to this city? And they said, housing, parks, education. So everything was sort of quality of life related issues. So I think, from an employer point of view, if they want to continue to attract talent, they need to realize that being proactive in relation to the provision of housing is important.
So Steve, you're a volunteer organization, philanthropic. Is that model of corporate philanthropy that Microsoft upholds the model?
So I would comment from both a developed country and a developing country, economically developing. So Microsoft is we're so pleased that they decided to give a $500 million commitment to housing in Seattle. That's great. As most people know, there was a very active conversation at the city on should there be a per head tax to pay for infrastructure and housing and schools. And most of the corporations in Seattle beat that back. And so having a corporation come in making a generous offer at the end, the tension is they're making the decisions about where the money goes, and it's less than the per head tax is going to be. So where does the city end up in the process? How do they plan for that? How does it fit into city schemes? So I think there's a tension in that.
All right. We're out of time, but I just want to thank my panel, Koon, Hean, Obinna, Alice, and Steve. Thank you very much. Thank you.